Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the sixth Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 14 or Proper 9, which this year falls on July 9th. We have two content notes for you this week. We talk about war during the deep dive, and we talk about state violence in the first reading.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, given our readings for today, our deep dive for today is on disarmament, including but not limited to nuclear disarmament. And there's a lot to say on this, but to start with, let's point out that the United States and Russia, between these two countries, have about 89% of today's nuclear weapons on the planet. And that's a little terrifying. Mm-hmm. So as we talk about disarmament in general, it's also important to talk about, what is the state of things right now that we want to change, right? And when we talk about how that works, and we'll have a few different sections on that, one of the things that we want to talk about is the fact that at heart, all of these systems, all of these processes come down to human people, come down to actual real life people. And that means that functionally speaking, these systems are never going to be perfect. They've tried to put various safeguards in, and they've thought about some of them, and they've put some more thought into some of those safeguards than others. But ultimately speaking, all of these processes are down to people, and they have to be, because you don't want a computer deciding that it's time to, destroy a country, which is fair. And sometimes this is a good thing. In fact, several times this has been a good thing. And sometimes we're not entirely sure if it's a good thing because these people go against what they're told to do. And on the one hand, we have stories of people who went against orders and saved lives, and that's wonderful. Mm-hmm. And in at least one case, probably saved the world. But also, that leads us to wonder what would happen if they were disobeying orders and, things went the other way. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately speaking, when it comes to weapons, what you don't want is unpredictability. So on the one hand, we have the story of Stanislav Petrov. You may have heard this name before. He was a member of the Russian military in the Soviet state. And in 1983, he refused orders to push the button to bomb the United States during what turned out to be a false alarm and malfunction of the Soviet system, where his computers were telling him that Russia was about to get destroyed by the United States because the United States had just launched missiles at them. It turned out the system was wrong. There was a malfunction. He refused to push the button. He saved the world. And much later, of course, he passed away recently in 2017. And we are grateful that he saved the world. But also, we acknowledge that ultimately speaking, that's an example of unpredictability in the process, and that's a little scary. On another note, there is the story of Harold Herring with one R, not two. And he is a former member of the United States Air Force. He was undergoing nuclear technician training and was discharged from that process and then also from the Air Force in 1975 after an incident during his training where he asked the question, how can I know that the order to launch came from a sane president? Mm-hmm. And he was not satisfied with the answers provided to him because, in fact, there really is no good way to have that kind of a safeguard because what is the definition of sane anyway?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that was a lot of people between 2016 and 2020. That was a legit concern.
Exactly.
That how do we know?
The process of the decision making is being made by someone who is, in tune with what most of us want, for example, that sort of thing. And so he pointed out some important weaknesses in our process, and that was very helpful. And then also we have for you an article from The Guardian. It's a column written by a former American nuclear missile operator, and he tells us that there have been a lot more near misses than we're aware of, and the process has more weaknesses than we know. And all of this is good reason for nuclear disarmament and also disarmament in general, because there are just too many possibilities for things to go wrong.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Well, and some logistical arguments for disarmament, but there's also just thinking about the economics of it and getting into the morality of it. So the Poor People's Campaign has been probably the most vocal organization around this, and especially pre-pandemic. But thinking about like the US budget as a moral document, the actual military budget in the United States, the budget is so militarized that, and we hear this a lot, but like the US spends more than the next 10 countries on military. This is as of like 2019, but I don't think it's changed much. And it spends more than 53%, so more than half of the federal discretionary budget goes towards military spending. When we look at the debates that happen over the budget, part of this is that military spending continues to increase while spending for other programs decreases. And that spending for other programs is a lot of like the basic needs that people have in terms of Medicaid, food stamps, SNAP programs, housing stuff, all of those things. And that's like, even veterans are not part of that military spending, right? Like it doesn't even include veterans programs. And so there's just such a stark difference in terms of where we put our value as a country. We put our value 53% towards military spending. And I think what the military does and what threats of violence do, it's part of and comes from a lot of like people's needs are not getting met. And it comes from greed, right? And so there's the catch-22 of the more we spend on military, the less money is spent on things like making sure everybody has what they need. And there are other ways to engage with countries. Like some countries, like increasing armament and those sorts of things are a thing that are done out of fear. But also, if your economy's not doing well, starting a war is a way to like jumpstart the economy in some ways because you have a lot of like government spending.
And I believe that in A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, I'm not entirely sure about the Revolutionary War, but I believe that for all of the other wars that America has entered, there has always been and by the way, this is going to do great things for our economy, conversation at the government level at some point before we started it.
Yeah. I mean,
every single
even
time.
The Revolutionary War, right? Like taxation was a huge...
Yes. No, there was definitely economic conversation around that. It's just we didn't have a government to have that conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah. But all of those things create this situation where it's like, okay, why are we actually going to war? And most of the time, there are particular places, and I used to be a like all peace all the time pacifist, and I have moved away from that a little bit. But I do think, sure, there are times when we have failed to respond in time to stop something before it becomes global war level. But for the most part, we could actually stop things beforehand. But so many of the wars that we have seen in the last century have been about the spread of communism or like ridiculous things.
I think you're saying that they don't follow the just war theory.
Yeah, thank you. Y'all, I have had 2 cups of coffee. I can't help it. I tried. Yeah. When I was in seminary, I went to Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations in what is now South Dakota for one of my classes, and we were talking to an Anglican priest there who's a member of the Lakota tribes, and he talked about how we talk about becoming more civilized, but the only thing that's become more civilized is our ways of killing people. And I think that that's an important thing to also address when it comes to disarmament, because what we're talking about, like even our biblical examples, like there's a limit to how much our biblical examples actually have to do with this. And we could get into, but won't this time, the national conversation on gun violence as well.
That's like 3 deep dives all on its own. So
yeah, hence we're going to not go at it quite yet. But the space that we encompass as a culture has become so dehumanized. We've become so good at killing people from so far away that it becomes easier to kill them because it's also easier to dehumanize those that we're killing. And then the ease with which we kill them makes it easier to dehumanize, and dehumanizing makes it easier to kill. And it's this vicious cycle. But we see that especially with rhetoric right now, and any rhetoric that like leads towards genocide is rhetoric that dehumanizes people and makes it easier to kill them. And so, like, in wars, they switched from using targets to human-shaped things to try and get people more used to shooting at humans, because so many people just wouldn't shoot when they were supposed to, because they couldn't shoot people, because it is against who we are as humans to want to shoot people. Like, we have to learn to hurt people and to try to kill them.
Sure.
So all of this stuff just like makes it so much harder to have a justification for disarmament, but like also just all of this, I think for me, the ultimate argument of why disarmament is because, as we say on this show, murder bad, because we deserve to live, because humans deserve to live. And just like with defunding the police, right? That money could be used to actually give people lives where we can flourish.
Right.
But it's not. Also, I think within this conversation, 2 books, one I've read and one I just learned about and I'm excited to read, I think are really helpful in this conversation. Steve Sheinkin was a history textbook writer, I think, and used to write boring history textbooks, and then was like, this is boring and nobody's engaging and like nobody's learning stuff. So he shifted and started writing history, but like in more of a novel form. And I read several years ago now, Bomb, the Race to Build and Steal the World's Most Dangerous Weapon, which is set in like the lead up to the use of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's fantastic. And part of what he talks about in it is so many of the scientists who worked on the atomic bomb then becoming advocates of disarmament. They were pursuing science without thinking about all of the possible repercussions of it. And then we're like, oh, shoot, this is not good. Murder bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so they became some of the most vocal in opposition of atomic bomb development. And there was a like, everybody else is doing it, so we have to do it kind of thing that happened a little bit. But I think it's a really interesting read, and his new book is called Fallout, Spies, Super Bombs, and the Ultimate Cold War Showdown. And so it's a similar thing, but from a Cold War perspective. But it gives such particular insight into the people who were involved, and also the politics, and also the after effects, the like, oh shoot, what did we do? Mm-hmm. That I think we need more space in our culture for saying, oh shoot, what did I do? And then trying to undo it. Because when we don't give people that space, things are never going to get better.
Everything keeps getting worse.
Yep. And then we just get like filled with shame about what we did and not having a way to undo it or a path to reparations or repairing the harm. It's just really harmful.
So another part of this conversation is, what is the difference between the kind of weapons we're talking about today versus the kind that, frankly, we all learned about in history classes from World War II in Japan, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man. And the short answer is that, wow, they are really just so much worse now. That they are so much bigger. We have an article for you on the history of the United States development of nuclear weapons, and that includes a comparison of those 2 bombs versus the weapons we have now, and also a look at what other weapons are in the world. And they're just a lot bigger and a lot worse now. So that's part of this conversation as well. Now, as we start talking about what does the nuclear disarmament movement in the world look like today, we also need to talk about what is the international law that has been created and established about all this. In 1963, the test ban was created and signed by several countries, including the United States. Basically, this was an agreement to stop testing nuclear weapons above ground. The only tests that could happen were underground. And the United States in particular has not tested any nuclear weapons since 1992. In 1968, there were 5 countries with nuclear weapons that signed the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which basically was to agree to not help other countries create new weapons. And this treaty was extended indefinitely in 1995. And since then, there are now 191 countries that have signed on to this treaty. Those countries do not include North Korea, which actually used to be part of the treaty and then left, India, Israel, Pakistan, or South Sudan. So
Interesting.
those are countries that are not signed on to it. 147 countries have signed a ban on fissile materials, the stuff you need to make a nuclear weapon. And this was created by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The US is not a country that is signed on to that treaty.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, the United States has not signed on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been signed by over 120 different countries. As we talk about the nuclear disarmament movement in general, Wikipedia has a very extensive and specific article on that we can point you at. I was particularly stunned when I saw that even Henry Kissinger is on board with nuclear disarmament. If a genuine war criminal who has, done all kinds of horrible things thinks that this weapon is too much, like that might be a sign, folks. I'm just saying. Mm-hmm. This page also includes a list of important treaties that have happened over the years. And I thought it was interesting that the only country who has created and then completely dismantled a nuclear armament was South Africa. And it turned out that they created it during the last days of apartheid and then dismantled it just after apartheid ended. And so there was yet another reason to be in favor of the end of apartheid. Right. That was great.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about disarmament, of course, most of us go to nuclear disarmament, and there's a lot of stuff around that, particularly every first week in August. There's a peace week specifically focused on nuclear disarmament and remembering those who were destroyed with the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes.
And those are not the only ways that we kill people. Like I said before, the ways that we have become more civilized at killing people include also other things besides just nuclear weapons, but also the drone programs that we have, where we're literally flying machines, like where we take all or almost all of the risk out of our people and kill without as much specificity even other people. So this happens.
Right.
We've seen the drone programs, the number of casualties, as they say, the number of innocent people who are killed, in addition to military personnel who are killed, is significantly more when it is a drone program, because those go in and bomb less discriminately, even when they're targeted. And so there's also been a significant amount of work done around drone disarmament and the use of drones and decreasing or stopping the use of drones. My favorite go-to for this is the Des Moines Catholic Workers, because they are amazing. Shout out to the Des Moines Catholic Workers, because I think Catholic workers in general, but especially the Des Moines ones. There is an Iowa Air National Guard drone command center in Des Moines, and they have regular vigils there, but also every year they do direct actions there, like the number of Catholic workers who have been arrested for trying to dismantle bombs. This year in May, the Veterans for Peace and the Des Moines Catholic Worker had their second annual Armed Forces Day Stop the Killing rally and did a direct action at the command center. And this was their second annual of this particular thing, but they've been doing it for many more years than that. And I think like part of this is this combination of Veterans for Peace, which is an organization of people who have been in the trenches, literally, the ones who have been doing the fighting and doing the killing and doing the dying, saying, no, this needs to stop. And if you want more about that, you can definitely check out our episode from January of this year with Pastor Adam Dowd, who is in Veterans for Peace. But it's this combination of Veterans for Peace and then also like Des Moines Catholic Workers and various other religious communities. And so the coming together of like, what does our faith actually call us to? And what are the people who are some of the most affected? I would say the people in other countries that our military has killed are the most affected, right? But those two groups, when they come together, there's a clear argument for disarmament just from that and from the respect of those two groups that mean we should be listening if we aren't already. But it is much easier said than done, particularly given our government these days. And so there are some big challenges that we have to disarmament, broadly speaking. And we'll share one of the articles that we found that kind of goes into more detail about the challenges. But one of the challenges is to address the disconnect between the commitments and the implementation, right? And it's easier said than done. Yeah, we can say we want nuclear disarmament, we want full disarmament, but how do we implement that in a way that gets people on board and that keeps people safe? Because one of the main arguments of armament is mutually assured destruction. Mad. I am safe as long as you will also be in peril if you do something to me, which is bad. Another challenge is how to address the lack of inertia of disarmament initiatives that the UN has laid out. There's just not energy and movement happening. And so it's harder to start the movement than to keep it going, right? And so because we need to get it going and really ramp it up, it takes something, and we haven't figured out exactly what that something is yet.
Yeah.
And then a third challenge is how to take the quote-unquote human security perspective into account, and that's the mutually assured destruction part. How do you navigate the space of, if we don't have any, it will be easier for someone to kill us because they won't have to worry about retaliation. And that, part of it is the, shifting priorities and shifting funding. And so as we shift funding to helping get basic needs met for people and countries, we shift our global financing so that we're not exploiting countries who have been colonized. That helps develop human security in a different way. And that's part of, again, defunding does that too. We're developing human security and country security by investing in what is needed for the people instead of threats of violence, a la Pax Romana. And then the fourth challenge is how to achieve and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. It's one of those, you can't put the cat back in the bag. You can't, or the toothpaste back in the tube.
I mean, both of those would be difficult. Only one of them is more likely to end up with you getting injured.
It's true.
So.
It's true. But once the knowledge is out there, how do you take it back? How do you not keep doing it? And I think there's some really great literature out there about that. The Travelers series has a special episodes that they went into of people who developed the science around what would become this terrible thing. And so they went back and were trying to stop them from doing it. And once the people were informed of what their discovery would lead to, they themselves scrapped it and destroyed evidence and stopped pursuing it, which is a different place than not doing it at all. The Graceling Realm books, the latest book, has some it's at the level of grenade type things more than full nuclear bombs, but it has this development of technology for a bomb, and then only one person still has this. And how do they keep it secret? Do they not? How do they hide it? How do they protect it? How do they keep their country safe and really try to keep their whole little realm world safe as well? And then the fifth challenge is how to address nuclear weapons and the economy. And that we've talked about some, that actually there's defense spending does have a huge impact on the economy, but we also could be spending that money in more effective ways to stimulate the economy. Yeah. We could literally just spend that money by giving it to every human being as a universal basic income, and it would stimulate the economy significantly more.
We could even just give it to, most human beings and say, leave out the billionaires.
Leave out the billionaires, but
Okay, so we are nerds at church, and it is probably about time for us to talk about the Bible. I can't speak for Emily, but when we first started talking about this, the Bible verse that jumped to my mind was Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. No, when I say the Bible verse jumped to my mind, I am not saying that I immediately knew the reference. I had to Google it like any normal person. But this verse says that God shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
Yep.
So if you want biblical precedent, you've got it.
Yeah. And I think that's the one that is the most common for us to use. So another reading is Zechariah 9, which is today's reading, which is part of why we're doing this deep dive in the first place. And it gets into, this king who is coming, who will get rid of war horses and all of that stuff. There's also a lot that is connected to Jesus both in terms of Jesus rebuking Peter and telling him to put his sword back into his sheath when Jesus is being arrested. And also this like expectation that some people had that the Messiah would be a commander, right? Where it's like the Messiah will lead the revolution against Rome. Whereas Jesus was like, that's not what I'm about. And so that concept comes into play, and that's scattered kind of throughout the Gospels, depending on where we're looking specifically. But yeah, there's just so many different kind of smaller places and less obvious places as well.
Also, it turns out, like we said earlier, the Bible says that murder is bad on a fairly regular basis. There's a commandment about it, you may remember, number 5 if you're Lutheran. And so that seems like a theme we should mention, not just because we're very fond of it.
Yes. Murder, bad indeed. And then also there are lots of, like, we can't do this deep dive without acknowledging that there are a lot of complicated stories within the Bible that include war. And there are also lots of ways to avoid war. So marching around Jericho, like, that also has the complication of, like, clear colonization. But marching around Jericho and playing music instead of just marching into Jericho with violence.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure that if a city wall fell down, somebody might have gotten hurt in that process, but even if it was by trumpet, but still.
True. And there's also, like, the story about the army where instead of, like, having the army go at the army at night, they just played a bunch of music. They made everybody be musicians in the army instead, and it intimidated the other army, who was like, if they have this many musicians, how many soldiers do they have? And so the army fled. And like, they didn't have more soldiers. They would have probably been slaughtered. But using those creative ways, I think that's part of the gift of the Bible, is there are so many creative ways to avoid violence. And again that comes up, that there is violence and there are creative ways of avoiding violence.
Yeah. And then, again, we are still nerds at church, and so in addition to talking about the Bible, we also talk about pop culture and nerdery. And the first example of nuclear disarmament that popped into my head from pop culture when we started talking about this is an episode from the original TV show Leverage, which was called The 3 Days of the Hunter Job, in which they are trying to destroy the reputation of a sensationalist journalist so that the people whose lives that she's destroyed will be able to repair their lives and move on. And as a part of that, they sell her essentially a fake conspiracy theory that involves nuclear weapons. And there is actually a bit where one of the characters has to pretend to be a general in order to go in and get them out of a military base that they snuck onto, because she grabbed onto the theory a little stronger than they were expecting her to and wound up dragging one of them with her onto this thing. And so there's this great bit with Timothy Hutton saying that, well, I'm glad you guys caught these two, because, we did this at 3 other bases and they were painting their names on missiles with lipstick within 20 minutes. So you guys were really on the ball today. Good job. While trying to get them out of the base. It was very fun.
That's fantastic. Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah.
Also, one of the stories that always sticks with me when it comes to disarmament and war and the complicated world we live in is what Toby on the West Wing said at one point, where he's talking to these folks who are protesting the free trade agreements and the lack of protection for workers and workers' rights and those sorts of things in them especially, but also just like in general. And full disclosure, I am a fair trade, not free trade kind of proponent. But what Toby says is that free trade agreements are violence prevention. Yeah. And that gets at that, like, economics and the war and the, like, helping people get the money that they need, get the resources that they need to get needs met, prevents violence, prevents war on the, like, global scale and with countries, and also on the, like, more micro individual people within countries, state kind of level.
Yeah. There are also oodles and oodles of post-nuclear apocalyptic novels and video games. I was kind of raised on that era of science fiction. But in a moment of recognition that, we don't always have to talk about nuclear bombs. There was a bit in the novel The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein, where the inhabitants of the moon are basically rebelling against Earth, and they throw giant rocks at Earth because they have lots of rocks. It's not hard for them to use the catapult they already have for other reasons to throw those rocks at Earth, and they don't have to use bombs. And as it turns out, it takes a while to convince the population of Earth in general that A, the rocks are going to land where the moon people say they're going to land because they've done the math, and B, no, actually, these are just rocks. They're not nuclear bombs, which means that there isn't going to be fallout, so you don't have to worry about that part. Just get out of the way of the rocks. And I thought it was an interesting exploration of, actually, we have other options, which I appreciated.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I was thinking about this in pop culture, and I was thinking about The Expanse. And in one of the story arcs towards the end of The Expanse so in The Expanse, Mars is literally basically just the military. But there's like the Earth and Moon, which is the United Nations, which is like the one group, and then Mars, and then the Belters, which is like all of the people who work for the other ones and don't have that much power.
Yeah.
And there's a big story arc of the Belters resisting and getting more power and that sort of thing. But there's this one part where Marco Inaros, who like makes himself the leader of the Belters and like that sort of a thing. And it starts out, and it like as it first starts, it's secret, but puts Mars's like military grade cloaking device, like cloaking material on asteroids, and then redirects the asteroids so that they become meteors, which turn into meteorites and hit Earth and cause, like, again, not nuclear fallout, but massive destruction, and hits major cities and that sort of a thing. And it's just like this absolute devastation caused by like literally turning outer space stuff into bombs, not nuclear bombs, but still bombs of like destruction. And
Right. Star Trek also has tried to imagine a world. I tried to explain the concept of the world presented in the Star Trek universe as eventually humans realized that murdering each other was a bad idea, and so instead, to keep themselves busy, they decided to go out into space. Like, that is legit the plot that leads up to the world of Star Trek. And specifically, in the original series, there is an episode called A Taste of Armageddon, where Captain Kirk and his crew from the Enterprise bump into a world that is populated by essentially humans. And that world realized that weapons and war destroyed too much stuff, and they were tired essentially of the property damage. And so instead of doing regular war, what they eventually started doing was they started having their wars via computer simulation. And then the people who the simulation declared had died would then report to a place to be humanely executed. Yeah, no, Captain Kirk and the rest of them were pretty surprised by this.
Murder bad, even when it's quote-unquote
murder
humane.
Bad. Yeah, and even when it doesn't involve property damage. Like, the absolute senselessness of this was...
Like, they are more...
was pretty noticeable, and yet, you know...
There's a thing, right, where right now in this country, the concern for property damage over the concern for killing people, like, that's a real word.
And if I'm remembering this right, I believe that this is also the episode where it turns out the real reason for this is that they have to keep the population down because they refuse to use birth control. And Captain Kirk has a very enthusiastic speech about that, which I assume is not supposed to just be because he wants to sleep with a lot of women. But yeah, so on the one hand, like, yes, that sounds ridiculous. On the other hand, you know, as we talk about drones, it seems like we're getting closer to that option, doesn't it? So,
yeah. The other one that I thought of was a Travelers episode. So, we've talked about it some. Travelers, initially, the consciousnesses were sent back to try to stop this meteorite that was going to destroy a bunch of people because they thought that that was the thing that led to the future being terrible. And instead, other things come up because certain people haven't been killed and that sort of a thing. And that increases the deadliness. And so that's like those scientists that I was talking about earlier are only alive because they weren't killed in the meteorite because the meteorite was stopped. And so then they have the space to figure out the science behind this technology. And so there's a thing that goes around that's like a really old billboard that goes around every once in a while that I saw the other day that's like, we who are committed to peace must be at least as motivated and committed as those who are committed to war.
Yeah.
Right? That it is an ongoing
That's
thing,
right.
and we have to continue to push towards it and continue to make progress. It's not like one and done. It's an always.
Yeah.
I can't help it. It's a constant vigilance thing. Forgive me for the reference, but yeah. So disarmament, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Go disarmament. Murder bad. That's the summary.
Murder bad.
As we dive into our readings, our first reading is Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 through 12. The prophet prophesies that a king will arrive humbly and command peace by removing instruments of violence from the nations and will set the prisoners free. So one of the themes of this passage is demilitarizing. What a surprise! But I was thinking about this, and one of the things that we didn't talk about in the deep dive, but that is also really connected in the ways that we have militarized and neglected the impact of that, is like leftover mines, not like where you get precious metals, landmines, like the things that you step on and they kill you. But there are a lot of leftover mines from wars, especially I think in Vietnam and Korea, I want to say, have a significant amount. And so people still are getting destroyed by those. And there's ways that they've found to try to disarm them. But it's hard and it's dangerous. And animals that can sense them are only so helpful. And there's just like this, but there's just this like, how do you remove the destruction? How do you remove the environmental devastation of war? And in Divergent, there's so much fear-mongering for what is outside the fence. The reality is that they're like keeping the people inside, but it is like, we don't know what happened. There was devastation and war and violence and all of this stuff is outside the fence. And instead of like trying to address it, trying to create like a better environment, it's just locked and people are just kept out.
Yeah.
It's dangerous.
So as we jump into the verses, we read in verse 10, God will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and God shall command peace to the nations. God's dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. And this verse reminds me both of the art of decoupage, which I just find endlessly fascinating, partly because of its fancy French name, where you take paper with designs or art or photos on it and you cut them out into certain shapes and you paste them onto other pieces of paper to make new art. And this can be lovely. And on the other hand, it also reminds me of the heresy of Marcionism, which tried to chop out a lot of the Bible as no longer being relevant to Christianity, when in fact, as it turns out, it was, because you really can't have the New Testament without the Hebrew Scriptures. And so it turns out that if you're going to go cutting things out of other things and pasting them onto other things, how and why you make your choices are going to matter. So like God choosing to cut out war from the universe is one thing, but if humans try to make choices like that, we generally get them wrong a lot more often.
I was like, I feel like Glenn Beck one time tried to like cut out anything that referred to social justice or something. There was something about like social justice in the Bible, and like,
oh goodness,
people were like, okay, let's cut out every time the Bible talks about economic justice or social justice. And it's just like,
3 pages long.
Well, it's illegible. Like you cannot read
Incoherent.
it because it.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. Decoupage, however, super fun.
Yes.
I looked at verse 10 and specifically the second half of verse 10 where it says, God's dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. And I can't help it. We're recording this just before the 4th of July. And I'm sorry, all I can think of is the line like, from sea to shining sea. And that is not at all, that song is not at all how I feel right now in this country. Like it especially with all of the Supreme Court decisions last week. But that is what.
Also, it's Alaska and Hawaii erasure.
It is. But that is what I read. And yeah. Also, I do love that we are measuring with water. But yeah, I just was like, I can't, that's the only thing I can think of.
Sure.
Yeah. But also, like, I feel like that makes this episode, I do feel like this episode is, like, really well timed. We did not plan it this way at all.
We never do. And yet it turns out the Holy Spirit might be at work in the lectionary, despite all of our problems with it.
Weird how that works. And then in verse 11, we read, "As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit." And that, like, I don't know what the waterless pit is, but prisoners, waterless pits, it just sounds like, I don't know, prisoners of war or torture or something. And then I'm thinking about all of the shows like 24 and all of those shows that were basically just propaganda to make torture and surveillance more acceptable to us and make us think that it works when torture does not, and that it's okay when mass surveillance is actually really bad. Ta-da!
Yeah. And then in verse 12, we read, "Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you double." And, okay, this episode needs another theme. So my additional theme for this episode is going to be what I read on my summer vacation, because I just got back from a few days off, and I read several books, and I'm going to share them with you. So it just worked out that way. So I just finished reading The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. And in that book, the main character, Maya, finds himself unexpectedly the emperor after his estranged father and 3 older brothers all die when their airship crashes. And he is very much experiencing the job of emperor as a prison, like throughout the book. He loses a lot of his personal choices. Like, suddenly, it is no longer his decision whether he gets married or to who. He loses absolutely all privacy due to how the system of his bodyguards work. He is never alone. But also, as the book goes on, he starts to become and then becomes more and more hopeful, because as he has a very different background and viewpoint than pretty much all of the previous emperors, he starts to realize that he can make helpful changes for normal people of the empire. And so the book actually has this lovely thread of hope, despite all of the issues he's facing.
Yay, hope.
Yeah.
That, I feel like that's a trope, though, like someone who's like becomes a monarch or is going to become a monarch and just like feels trapped in that, while there's other, usually it's paired with like somebody else who's like, really? Because let me tell you about my life. And they're like, economically.
Oh, we'll get there.
Okay. Then continue.
Sure. Well, not right away. First, we'll jump to our second reading for this episode, which is from Romans chapter 7, verses 15 through 25a. Paul muses that even when he doesn't want to sin, he finds himself doing so, and sin always seems to be close at hand, but that through Jesus Christ, he is free from complete bondage to sin.
So one of the themes in this passage, it's not really a theme, but a question I have for you, Kay, and our dear listeners. Has Paul ever heard himself speak? Like, reading this feels like Fred Stoller's character, whose like outfit is one of those construction cones with the like whirly siren on top, in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the original, not the reboot, who showed up occasionally and was like, danger, danger, and then warned them that the consequences will be dire. And it was just like this monotone and this like, and that's all I could think of with Paul. It was just like, I do not do the things I want to do, but the things I want to do, I do not do. And, Paul, this could have been 2 sentences long.
Well, so related to that, as we jump into the verses, in verse 15, we read, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate." And I believe, if I remember correctly, that I brought up this passage last year in our episode with the deep dive on sobriety, when we talked about the wedding at Cana. And I mentioned that I really like talking about this passage with teenagers because anyone who is going through puberty instinctively understands this concept, that I do things I don't want to do and I can't do the things I do want to do. And I also just finished listening to an episode of Homebrewed Christianity from last spring, I think, with my husband yesterday because he's preparing to enter seminary and we've been listening to a bunch of stuff together. And in this episode, Trip Fuller basically commented that in order to understand the full depth of St. Augustine's understanding of the sinfulness of human nature, you have to also have a deep understanding of just how bad humans can get at our worst moments. Because, like, even good people have bad impulses and have prejudices. And when you work in a pastoral role for a lengthy period of time, you start to see that when you are constantly spending time with people at their worst moments, especially. Yeah. And so you can't read Augustine without also understanding that he has, because of his life experience, a very deep understanding of the worst aspects of humanity. And I'm not entirely sure that I'm on board with like giving Augustine a pass for this reason, because Augustine did a whole bunch of more complicated stuff that I don't have time for right now. But I will say that I have noticed that as I've gotten older and had more experience with learning about the worst aspects of humanity and our worst impulses, I have started to have a lot more patience with Paul. Because when you start reading Paul with that understanding and seeing that Paul would have had the life experience to have some of that knowledge himself, suddenly a lot of the stuff that he says and a lot of the things that he like doesn't seem to trust people with makes more sense. Because if you start accepting that he's not saying that no one should be able to do this, but he is saying that some people should not be able to do this. Yeah, okay, I'm on board with that. I've met that guy, you know? So.
Okay, fair. Interesting. Okay, coming to the defense of Paul.
Well, I've said this before. I still have my issues with him, and he definitely could have, used an editor or 6. But yeah, once you start understanding more of the background, that helps. I believe that episode of Homebrewed Christianity was called The 5 Most Offensive Things I Learned in Seminary Theology, rather than the Bible episode that they did for that.
We'll link to the episode in the episode description for our listeners, as we usually do with any podcast references. So in verse 17, Paul writes, "But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me." And I was like, solid scapegoat, Paul. Like, how do you argue with that? It's not me. It wasn't me. It was sin. I swear. Also, I feel like little kid Paul would have been super annoying. Like, and now I want to cast him as one of the, like, baby Muppets.
I'm not sure that baby Paul would be lovable enough to be a Muppet.
It's true.
Like, the baby Muppets are all pretty wonderful even when they are being irritating. I think baby Paul might be more along the line of, one of the neighbors in the Rugrats TV show. That sounds much more in character.
That's fair, yeah.
Also, the Rugrats show acknowledged the existence of Jewish people, so that seems reasonable.
It's true. One of the few shows with Jewish people to have Paul, a Jew. Yeah, that works. Yeah. So then I kept reading. And in the next verse, in verse 18, we read, "For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it." Paul, bad theology. I'm just like coming for Paul in this. And usually I like Romans, but like, nothing good dwells within me, that is in my flesh. God's image dwells within you, in your flesh, Paul. Also, shout out to Planet Sex, I believe Netflix series. It might have been on Hulu, though. That goes into a lot of what is also good in our flesh as humans and is like this whole great exploration, not suitable for work, but a wonderful exploration of, all of that.
Okay. And then in verse 21, we read, "So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand." And after I finished reading The Goblin Emperor, I then read The Witness for the Dead, which is not exactly a sequel, but it's sort of a book that borrows one of the characters from The Goblin Emperor and then throws him into a new series of his own. This character is a priest for the god of the dead in that universe, and he has a little magical ability, and essentially what happens is that he is set up to serve as a detective for situations that involve death, which is not just about murders, but also is about like legal battles over wills and things like that. And as I read the book, I was continually being struck by how very easily his position and abilities could be abused if he had evil or even just more selfish inclinations. Because in order to do his job, he has to be trusted by people to be telling the truth. And they have ways of proving that his magical abilities are real and that they do work. But the only way that they know that what he's saying that they found out for him is the truth is just to trust him as a person. And as it turns out, he is like very deeply connected to his sense of duty and has actually like lost personal things of great importance to him because he was doing his job and telling the truth. He is that kind of person, but there's no way to regulate that. So it struck me throughout the book that he could cause so much havoc if he even just lied a little bit.
Yeah. Yep. That's like in Divergent, the abnegation. They have to be so selfless that even just a little ruins
And
the thing.
so you had mentioned the economic class issues that are involved with an emperor believing that they are trapped in their position. This book, and I'm about to start reading the next one, examines that a little more, because you see people at all economic levels.
Yeah. And I mean, the reality is, I think a lot of people, if not everybody, feels trapped in different ways. But yeah.
And like not having choice over who you marry, that's an issue. Like I'm on board with that being terrible. Sure.
Yeah. And then our final reading for this episode is Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 through 19 and 25 through 30. Yes, we're skipping the woes. Jesus is frustrated by some of the people he meets, but still promises them rest and gentleness. So the first part of this, the theme that stuck out for me was like, it's the Mary dilemma, but for men. So the Mary dilemma is the idea that particularly women are either prudes or sluts. So they either like...
Oh, yes. The Madonna whore dichotomy.
Yeah.
I believe is...
And then like, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, has all the things because she is both a mother and a virgin, and it's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird and creepy, but I was like, oh, it's like that, but for men, and therefore like doesn't have anything to do with sex because men can just be whatever they want with sex, but it's like either you don't do anything like John or you're a glutton like Jesus, which honestly, like, I don't mind being a glutton. It's tasty. Yeah.
I mean, I had donuts for breakfast, so I don't really get to argue.
I did not, but I wanted donuts for breakfast.
Yes. So as we jump into the verses, in verse 17 we read, "We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn." Or, in other words, you did not follow the prescribed script for how this was all supposed to happen. And another book that I just finished on my vacation is Legends and Lattes, which was by Travis Baldtree.
I have heard such good things about it.
It is so much fun.
Oh, great. I really want to read it.
Yes, it is about an orc named Viv. She used to be an adventurer, and she hangs up her sword in order to open up a coffee shop in a town that she's visited. And she has to continually, throughout the book, fight this urge to solve all of her problems with violence, because that's how she always used to solve all of her problems, and she's an orc, so it usually worked out pretty well for her. But she doesn't want to keep doing that. She wants to have a different kind of life, and so she has to keep fighting that instinct. And, you know, she's not above flexing her muscles here and there when it'll, you know, make a difference in someone's decision-making process, but she also wants to find a new way of life, and so she very carefully does not enter into actual violence. And it's an interesting process to watch.
That is fascinating, and particularly within the realm of, like, disarmament.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was very appropriate.
Yeah. Indeed. And then in verse 19 we read, "The human one came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deed.'" So this is what Jesus says. And I was thinking about that and like how many men get to play the drunkard as a plot device to sneak something past, right? So you get like Elias does it in Ember in the Ashes. Harper does it in a later book in that series. And it's basically like anyone who's not a man basically never gets to do it because they do it and it's like, okay, people take a step back and kind of ignore them. But if anybody else did it who's not a man, then they would be more susceptible to violence or whatever because of this need for, you know, constant vigilance and stuff.
Yeah.
And then in verse 29, we read, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And now I'm picturing like highly suspicious oxen looking at Jesus as he speaks incredulously about easy yokes and being like, this yoke is not easy, until he also gets under the yoke to help. And then they're like, oh, okay, more people and less.
I feel like that could totally be an episode of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. That's completely a possibility.
That sounds fantastic, actually.
I also read verse 30. Jesus said, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And my immediate reaction was, okay, so A, Jesus, that is not true. Being a Christian is not easy. You discuss that at great length elsewhere in the Bible. So really, dude, come on. But also, B, I just finished reading Also, A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher, which is a pen name for Ursula Vernon, who wrote the Digger webcomic I've mentioned several times on this podcast. And in this book, you discover that magic, no matter how simple and lighthearted you think your magical gift might be, can still bring quite the heavy yoke and a large burden to your life, like, say, having to defend your whole city because there are no other people available to do so, even though all of your magical abilities revolve around bread and also you're only 14 years old. It's complicated. Like, the eventual conclusion that the book comes to is that no one should have to be a hero because being a hero sucks.
Yeah.
But also, bread. So it is still a very fun book and yet also hits a lot of good emotional notes.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic and would have been so well placed for our first year's Bread of Life. Jesus Loves You series.
Yes, I don't think it was actually written then. It only came out last year.
I was going to say, it's before those times, but that sounds fantastic. Also, when you said you were going to do Kay's greatest reads from vacation, I did not realize how thoroughly you actually were going to do this. And also very impressed with how many books you've read on your 1 week of vacation.
Yes, I read 4 books. So the point of the vacation was naps and reading, basically, and occasional time with fuzzy animals. So
solid.
It worked out pretty well. And now for our most disarming segment, let's make a Muppets musical.
That's fantastic.
Emily, do you have thoughts on who to cast from our readings this week?
I mean, we already established that Paul wouldn't fit in Baby Muppets. I do think there's an easy Sesame Street lesson about cooperation and teamwork in the my yoke is easy and my burden is light thing, with you get Elmo trying to carry something and then is having trouble, and so then you could pull in, I'm mixing universes, you could pull in Gonzo to help,
like usual,
and then Big Bird and Snuffleupagus also help, and it gets to be so big that you also get Elmo who's just holding on and dangling his feet because it's so that just seems like a delightful illustration for that, I think.
Yeah. So if I can go outside of the Jim Henson universe for this, when we started talking about disarmament, the first children's character that came to mind for me was actually Calvin and Hobbes from Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip. There is a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip where Calvin is delighted because he is holding in both of his very tiny arms 4 or 8 water balloons. He has so many water balloons. He is so well armed. He's going to win this water balloon fight because Hobbes, standing across from him, only has 1 water balloon. And so he's trash talking Hobbes like he usually does. And Hobbes lets him trash talk for a minute, kind of tilts his head, and then throws his water balloon at Calvin, who immediately realizes that with both of his arms full of water balloons, he can't actually throw any of them. So he kind of panics, throws all of them up into the air, tries and fails to grab one, and winds up completely soaked, not only by Hobbes's water balloon, but also his own water balloons, which is exactly what Hobbes knew would happen the whole time. I love that one so much. And also, it seems so appropriate for our episode today. And I would love to see both Calvin and Hobbes go visit Sesame Street and the Muppets, because I think they'd have a great time. And I'm talking about the actual Calvin from the comic strip and not the weird cartoons that other people have made about him. Mm-hmm. But the actual Calvin from the comic strip has a very mischievous but also a very appropriate attitude for all of those, and I think they'd have a great time, and Hobbes would really love getting to meet all of the other characters.
Yeah, so that would be fantastic. I love that idea. I'm here for it. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 7th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than creating and then dismantling an entire nuclear armament system. Just ask South Africa.
Indeed. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.